The dream had been years in the making. The Lakeside Lodge was more than just a house. It was a vision of peace and independence, a place far removed from the endless noise of crowded neighborhoods and the stifling rules of suburban living. The property stretched along a curve of the lake, its wooden dock jutting out like a finger pointing into the water. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth, and the evenings glowed with the shimmer of orange sunsets dancing across the ripples. The move itself was grueling, boxes stacked to the ceiling, furniture hauled up the gravel drive, every step heavy but fueled by anticipation. When the last moving truck pulled away, the silence that followed was unlike anything else. It wasn't just the absence of traffic or city hum, it was true quiet, the kind that let you hear birds rustling in the branches, frogs croaking at the shoreline, and the soft lap of waves against the dock. For the first time in years, there was space to breathe, but peace rarely goes uncontested. The lodge carried a unique history. Built decades before the surrounding community was developed, it stood on land purchased directly from the county. At the time, no association existed, no governing body of neighbors dictating what color paint could be used or how tall grass could grow. Over time, as development crept in and subdivisions sprouted, a homeowners association was formed to manage roads, common spaces, and property standards. Yet the lodge remained exempt. Its deed, notarized and recorded long before, placed it firmly outside their jurisdiction. To the new owner, this was part of the lodge's charm. It wasn't just the lake or the view, it was the freedom that came with it. No board meetings, no arbitrary fines, no committees telling you how to live on your own property. But to the HOA, this exemption was more than an oddity. It was a challenge. The first sign came only 2 days after moving in. A crisp envelope appeared on the porch, stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside was a letter full of official-sounding language, a notice of non-compliance, citing supposed violations of community guidelines. The words dripped with authority: mandatory membership, unauthorized structure, assessment due. At first, it seemed like a mistake. Surely the board didn't know the property's history, didn't realize the exemption was already on record. The letter was filed away, dismissed as a misunderstanding, but the letters kept coming. Every morning brought a new envelope, sometimes 2. One cited the dock as an unapproved addition. Another demanded repainting of the lodge's exterior to conform to community palette standards. Third warned of fines for failure to submit. Landscaping plans, each claim was absurd. The property was private, the HOA had no jurisdiction, and yet the tone of the letters grew increasingly aggressive. The message was clear. Resistance was futile. Neighbors began to notice. Some stopped by with sympathetic smiles, murmuring warnings about the board's reputation. The HOA was known for wielding its power with ruthless precision, fining residents for lawn ornaments, for the color of shutters, even for leaving trash cans at the curb a few hours too long. They had fined one family so heavily for a swing set deemed non-compliant that they eventually sold their home. Their tactics were not about fairness. They were about control. The lodge, standing proudly beyond their reach, was an insult to that control. What began as letters soon escalated to visits. Members of the board appeared at the driveway, armed with clipboards and self-importance. They peered through sunglasses at the siding, muttered about the dock, scribbled notes as though building a case. Sometimes they came alone, sometimes in pairs, always uninvited, always unwelcome. Their presence was deliberate, meant to intimidate. It was less about documenting violations and more about sending a message. We are watching you. The homeowner knew the truth. The deed had been checked, the exemptions verified, the documents sealed. The HOA's authority stopped at the edge of its defined boundaries, and this property lay firmly outside. But knowledge of the law did not stop the harassment. Instead, it highlighted the board's true strategy: persistence. If they couldn't win legally, they would try to win psychologically, through relentless pressure. Weeks passed, and the notices became thicker. Some threatened escalating fines, others claimed the property was in default of obligations that did not exist. The language grew harsher, the fonts bolder, as if louder words could manufacture legitimacy. It wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about breaking resistance through sheer exhaustion. Then came the day they pushed too far. A convoy of vehicles pulled up the gravel drive one afternoon. Not just a pair of board members, but nearly the entire group. They marched up the path in a line, clipboards held like shields, determination etched on their faces. At the front was the board's president, a woman with a sharp bob haircut and an even sharper expression. Without hesitation, she declared that the lodge was now under the association's authority. Mandatory membership fees would apply, and failure to comply would result in enforcement action. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of conquest. Neighbors watched from a distance, drawn by the commotion. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered nervously. The board had always been bold, but this was something new. This wasn't fines over mailboxes or warnings about lawns. This was a direct attempt to seize control of a property that did not belong to them. What the board didn't realize was that every step had already been documented. Each letter, each visit, each false claim had been carefully stored, scanned, and cataloged. Complaints had been filed, not just with the county but with higher offices. Evidence had been compiled into a thick dossier that painted a clear picture of harassment and overreach. The homeowner had been patient, waiting for the board to reveal its true intentions, and now they had. As the board left that afternoon, their vehicles rumbling down the drive with smug satisfaction, they believed victory was near. They thought their decree carried weight, that their authority was unshakable. But in truth, their arrogance had just triggered the next stage, because even as they drove away, another letter was on its way. This one bore not the seal of a neighborhood association, but the seal of the state. It carried the weight of the governor's office, a weight no HOA could possibly ignore. The storm was gathering, and the lodge stood at the center. The first battle had been fought, but the war for the Lakeside Lodge was only beginning. The arrival of the letter was quiet, almost anticlimactic. It came in a plain white envelope tucked neatly among the usual stack of mail. No bold red warnings, no aggressive fonts demanding attention. Yet its presence carried a gravity that none of the HOA's dozens of notices ever could. For on its face was a seal, the seal of the governor's office. The homeowner had expected it, though perhaps not so soon. After weeks of relentless harassment and intimidation, after countless nights documenting, scanning, and compiling evidence, the case had been formally submitted. Complaints had been filed not only with the county but with the state itself. The governor's staff had responded with a careful request for documentation, and every scrap of proof had been delivered. The process had been slow, bureaucratic, but steady. The HOA, in its arrogance, had assumed their authority extended beyond the borders of their neighborhood. What they did not anticipate was the reach of state law and the willingness of the governor's office to enforce it. Inside the envelope was a letter, simple but devastating. It acknowledged receipt of the evidence, confirmed the legality of the property's exemption, and made clear that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the lodge. Furthermore, it warned that continued harassment could be interpreted as an abuse of power, subject to legal consequences. It was not flowery, not dramatic, but its message was unshakable. The lodge did not belong to the HOA. It belonged to its rightful owner. The homeowner sat quietly after reading it, letting the words sink in. The weeks of harassment, the endless parade of letters, the smug visits from board members, all of it had been a storm fueled by arrogance. And with a single piece of paper, the storm had been stripped of its power. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was validation. Proof that the law was on the side of truth. Word spread quickly. Neighbors, already buzzing from the board's dramatic attempt to claim the property, whispered about the governor's involvement. Some cheered quietly, thrilled to see the board challenged at last. Others were skeptical, wary of crossing the association's leadership. The HOA had long cultivated fear, and fear does not vanish overnight. Still, the balance had shifted. The once invincible board was now facing resistance from a force far greater than themselves. The board, however, was not ready to surrender. When the governor's letter arrived at their office, panic rippled through the ranks. For years, they had operated with unchecked authority, lording over residents with fines and threats, confident no one would challenge them. The arrival of a warning from the state was a direct threat to that empire. But rather than admit defeat, they doubled down. They called emergency meetings, drafted counterclaims, and sought ways to twist the narrative. To them, the letter was not an end, but an obstacle to overcome. The president of the HOA, sharp-eyed and relentless, insisted that the lodge was still within their reach. She argued that the maps were outdated, that the property lines were misdrawn, that some obscure clause in their charter gave them power over the land. Her voice carried conviction, but underneath it was fear, a fear that if they failed here, their authority everywhere else would begin to crumble. They launched their own campaign. More letters arrived at the lodge, this time dripping with indignation. They accused the homeowner of misrepresentation, of forging documents, of manipulating officials. They framed themselves as the victims, painting the property owner as a rogue element threatening the integrity of the community. It was a desperate pivot, but it was also dangerous. Lies, once put in writing, can unravel quickly under scrutiny. The homeowner did not flinch. Each new accusation was carefully filed alongside the growing mountain of evidence. Every letter, every visit, every threat only made the case stronger. The governor's office had already confirmed the exemption, and now they watched closely as the HOA dug itself deeper into a pit of its own making. Neighbors, too, began to take sides. A quiet divide formed within the community. Some rallied behind the board, convinced by their rhetoric that the lodge was an intruder, a rogue property defying the rules everyone else had to follow. They grumbled about fairness, about equality, about how one person shouldn't get to ignore the standards that bound the rest. Others, however, saw the truth. They recognized the board's power grab for what it was, greed disguised as governance. To them, the lodge represented freedom, a chance to see the board finally challenged and held accountable. The tension thickened with each passing day, and then the governor's office acted again. This time, there was no letter. There was a visit. A representative from the state arrived at the property, not with fanfare, but with quiet authority. Dressed in a simple suit, carrying a briefcase of documents, they stepped onto the lodge's porch and introduced themselves. Their purpose was clear: to observe firsthand, to confirm the validity of the claims, and to make it abundantly clear that the state was paying attention. The HOA board was informed of the visit, and within hours they descended on the lodge, eager to plead their case. They arrived in a swarm of vehicles, spilling out onto the gravel with clipboards and folders, their faces tight with determination. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. The state representative stood calmly as the board unleashed a torrent of arguments. They waved maps, cited bylaws, gestured at the dock, and spoke in sharp tones about community integrity. But for every claim, the representative produced a counterpoint. The deed was valid. The exemption was clear. The property lay outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Their words, once so heavy with authority, now fell flat against the quiet weight of the law. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the property, watching the clash unfold. Whispers turned into gasps as it became clear that the HOA's arguments were crumbling. The representative's calm explanations cut through the board's bluster like a blade, leaving them exposed and floundering. What had once been a show of dominance had become a public unraveling. The president of the HOA, red-faced and trembling, made one final declaration. She insisted that the lodge's presence threatened the harmony of the community, that it undermined the board's ability to maintain order. But the representative only nodded, as if acknowledging the desperation behind the words. Then, with deliberate calm, they announced that the matter was closed. The property was exempt. The law had spoken. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For the first time, the board had been directly, publicly, and unequivocally denied. Their power, once absolute, had been checked by a force they could not control. The board left in silence, their convoy crawling back down the road, their clipboards clutched tightly as if holding on to scraps of authority. The neighbors remained, buzzing with shock and excitement. For years, they had lived under the board's thumb, fearful of fines and reprisals. But now they had seen something different. They had seen the board defeated. The homeowner watched it all quietly, standing on the porch as the sun dipped low over the lake. The victory was not just personal, it was symbolic. The lodge had become more than a home. It was now a line in the sand, a challenge to unchecked power, a reminder that authority must have limits. But even in victory, there was caution. The board was wounded, not destroyed. Their pride had been shattered, but pride has a way of regrouping, of seeking revenge. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. As night settled over the lake, the lodge stood firm, its lights glowing softly against the darkness. The waters lapped gently at the dock. The trees whispered in the breeze, and the air carried the quiet promise of resilience. The governor's word had been spoken, and the truth was undeniable. Yet deep within the neighborhood, behind closed doors and whispered conversations, the board plotted. Their authority had been challenged, their power diminished. And to people who thrived on control, that loss was intolerable. The storm had not passed. It had only shifted. And soon the HOA would return, not with letters or visits, but with something far more dangerous. The defeat at the hands of the governor's representative was a public humiliation the board had never experienced before. For years, their word had been law within the community. Residents obeyed without question, fines were paid without protest, and dissent was quietly stamped out before it could spread. The HOA was used to operating like an unchallenged kingdom, its board members the self-appointed monarchs. But now, in front of neighbors who had long cowered under their rule, their authority had been dismantled with a single, calm declaration. The lodge was exempt. The board president, whose voice had once carried unshakable confidence, had been left red-faced and trembling as the representative from the governor's office silenced her arguments one by one. For the first time, the HOA's power was shown to have limits, and limits once revealed are difficult to hide again. Neighbors whispered for days after the confrontation. Some recounted the board's frantic arguments with barely concealed amusement. Others, emboldened by what they had seen, began to push back against minor fines and petty notices of their own. The illusion of the board's invincibility had cracked, and cracks tend to spread. But humiliation does not sit well with those who thrive on control. The board met in secret sessions, their gatherings more frantic and bitter than ever. They spoke in clipped tones, their voices sharp with anger. The lodge had become more than just a property in dispute. It had become a symbol of defiance. As long as it stood free, it mocked their authority. To them, it wasn't about fairness, community, or rules anymore. It was about pride. And pride, when wounded, becomes dangerous. The first sign of their retaliation was subtle. Trucks began circling the property late at night, their headlights sweeping across the lodge and dock. Engines idled in the darkness, sending an unspoken message. We are still watching. When approached, the trucks would speed away, disappearing into the neighborhood's winding streets. It was never enough to be a direct threat, never enough to be actionable, but always enough to remind the homeowner that the board had not forgotten. Then came the sudden surge of complaints filed with the county. Anonymous reports accused the lodge of everything from illegal septic systems to unsafe electrical wiring. Inspectors arrived unannounced, each apologetic but bound by procedure to check the claims. One after another, the complaints were dismissed as unfounded, but the disruption was constant. Each inspection meant hours wasted, each visit a reminder of the board's persistence. The harassment grew bolder. Flyers began appearing in neighbors' mailboxes, warning that the lodge posed a threat to property values, that its exemption from HOA rules would lead to chaos. The board painted the homeowner as a selfish outsider, someone who refused to play by the rules everyone else had to follow. They crafted a narrative designed to isolate, to pit the community against the lodge, hoping peer pressure would succeed where intimidation had failed. But the narrative didn't hold as firmly as they hoped. While some neighbors bought into the rhetoric, others saw through the manipulation. They remembered the governor's representative standing calmly on the lodge's porch, dismantling the board's arguments with ease. They remembered the look of desperation in the president's eyes as her authority slipped away. And they began to question whether the board truly acted in the community's interest, or only in its own. Frustrated by their inability to regain control, the board escalated further. They hired a surveyor, claiming that the property lines were unclear, that perhaps the lodge's dock extended into common land. The surveyor, pressured by the board, produced vague and conflicting measurements, which the HOA seized upon as proof of encroachment. Letters arrived once more, this time declaring the dock illegal and demanding its immediate removal. The homeowner, armed with official deeds and county maps, easily refuted the claim. But the process was exhausting. Every accusation, no matter how baseless, required time, energy, and paperwork to counter. The board's strategy was clear. If they could not win legally, they would win by attrition. As the weeks dragged on, the tension in the community grew unbearable. Conversations at the local store turned into hushed debates about the lodge. Neighbors eyed one another warily, unsure of which side each belonged to. Some rallied quietly behind the homeowner, grateful to see the board finally challenged. Others clung tightly to the board's authority, fearful of what might happen if the HOA lost its grip entirely. The board, sensing their control slipping, resorted to theatrics. At the next HOA meeting held in the community clubhouse, the president stood before the assembled residents and delivered a fiery speech. She spoke of the threat posed by the lodge, of the dangers of allowing one property to operate outside the rules. Her words dripped with alarmism, painting the homeowner as a reckless rule-breaker whose actions endangered everyone. But something unexpected happened. A handful of residents stood up and challenged her narrative. They pointed out the governor's involvement, the representative's clear ruling, the endless stream of baseless complaints. Their voices trembled at first, unused to defying the board, but they grew stronger with each word. The room, once dominated by fear, now buzzed with dissent. The president's speech ended not in applause, but in uneasy murmurs. The control she once wielded so easily was slipping through her fingers. The retaliation, however, did not stop. Late one night, the homeowner awoke to the sound of splintering wood. Rushing outside, they discovered the dock vandalized, boards torn loose, nails scattered across the shoreline. It was a deliberate act of sabotage, calculated to intimidate. No one claimed responsibility, but suspicion fell squarely on the board's loyalists. The damage was repaired, but the message was clear. The battle was no longer confined to paperwork and letters. The sheriff's office was notified. Reports were filed and security cameras were installed around the property. Each step tightened the defenses, but each step also deepened the sense of siege. The lodge, once a sanctuary of peace, had become a fortress under attack, and still the board pressed on. They filed a lawsuit, their boldest move yet. The claim alleged that the exemption was invalid, that the property had been improperly recorded decades ago, that the homeowner was in violation of community covenants. The lawsuit was flimsy, built on shaky interpretations and misrepresented documents, but it forced the homeowner into court. The case attracted attention beyond the community. Local news outlets picked up the story, drawn by the spectacle of an HOA challenging not only a homeowner, but the governor's office itself. Reporters descended on the neighborhood, interviewing residents, filming the lodge, broadcasting the feud to a wider audience. The board, once so confident in its dominance, now found its actions scrutinized by the public eye. The homeowner, though exhausted, stood firm. The governor's office provided statements supporting the exemption, county officials verified the deed's validity, and legal counsel prepared to dismantle the board's claims piece by piece. The courtroom became the new battlefield, and the board's arrogance became its own undoing. As the case dragged on, more neighbors began to see the truth. They watched as their HOA fees were funneled into a legal fight that seemed increasingly hopeless. They saw their board members grow more desperate, more frantic, as their arguments collapsed under scrutiny. Whispers turned into open criticism. Residents demanded answers, questioned priorities, and began to wonder whether the board truly represented them at all. By the time the judge issued a preliminary ruling, the outcome was clear. The exemption was valid. The property stood outside the HOA's reach, and the board's lawsuit was dismissed as meritless. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the ruling was read, and for the second time, the board's authority was shattered in public. The homeowner left the courthouse tired but resolute, knowing the battle was far from over. The board, humiliated again, would not surrender quietly. Their pride was too great, their need for control too consuming, and indeed, behind closed doors, they plotted once more. If the law could not deliver victory, they would seek another path, one darker, riskier, and more reckless than any they had tried before. The war for the lodge was escalating, and the HOA was preparing to strike in ways no one expected. The dismissal of the lawsuit should have been the end of it. The judge's ruling was firm, the law had spoken clearly, and the governor's office had left no ambiguity. The Lakeside Lodge was exempt. The HOA had no authority over it. The courtroom defeat was humiliating, and the board should have retreated, regrouped, and accepted the inevitable. But pride has a way of twisting defeat into obsession. The board members did not see the ruling as a conclusion. They saw it as a challenge. To them, the court's decision wasn't the final word. It was a dare, a gauntlet thrown down in front of them. And if they could not win by the law, they would find other means. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible. There were no more lawsuits, no more letters stamped with official seals. On the surface, the board appeared quiet, as though licking its wounds. Some neighbors even believed the feud was finally over. But beneath that calm, something darker was taking shape. The first incident came late one night, weeks after the ruling. Security cameras installed around the lodge caught the flicker of headlights in the distance. A vehicle slowed near the edge of the property, idling in the shadows. Moments later, the feed showed figures moving quickly across the dock. By morning, the damage was obvious. Ropes slashed, boards loosened, and one of the lodge's kayaks drifting out into the lake, half submerged. It wasn't vandalism born of mischief. It was calculated sabotage. The footage was grainy, the faces obscured by masks and hoods, but the timing was no coincidence. The board had vowed revenge, and the strike against the dock was their first blow. The homeowner filed a police report, submitted the footage, and repaired the damage. But as with the earlier incidents, the perpetrators were careful enough to avoid immediate consequences. It was intimidation, plain and simple. A reminder that the board was still watching, still striking, even if the law no longer stood in their favor, and the sabotage didn't stop there. A week later, the lodge's mailbox was found pried open, the mail scattered across the gravel drive. Bills, bank statements, personal letters, all torn and trampled. The sheriff's deputies noted the incident but admitted there was little evidence to pursue. Days after that, a delivery van reported being unable to access the drive because of debris scattered deliberately across the entrance. Shards of glass, bent nails, even a strip of barbed wire had been laid out in the night. Each act alone was frustrating but survivable. Together, they painted a picture of a campaign of harassment designed to break resolve. The homeowner, however, was not easily broken. Security was increased further. Motion sensor lights lit up the property at night. Additional cameras were installed, capturing every angle of the dock, the drive, and the lodge itself. Friends and supportive neighbors began stopping by more often, their presence a quiet form of solidarity. Each act of sabotage, instead of isolating the homeowner, only drew more attention to the board's desperation. And attention was the one thing the HOA did not want. Because as the sabotage grew bolder, secrets about the board itself began to surface. It started with whispers. Residents quietly mentioned irregularities in how the HOA collected and spent its dues, budgets that never seemed to balance, projects that were promised but never completed, a resurfaced tennis court that was billed to residents but never materialized. At first, these murmurs sounded like ordinary grumbling. Every community has its share of complaints about how money is managed. But the whispers grew louder, and soon patterns began to emerge. The board, it seemed, had more to lose than just a battle over jurisdiction. Digging into public records revealed troubling signs. Contracts for landscaping and maintenance were awarded to companies suspiciously tied to board members' relatives. Expenses for administrative costs ballooned far beyond what was typical, with little transparency about where the money was going. And HOA funds, tens of thousands of dollars collected from residents every year, were being funneled into the endless fight against the lodge, leaving little for actual community upkeep. The homeowner, already accustomed to documentation, began quietly gathering these threads. Copies of budgets, minutes from board meetings, receipts, and invoices, all collected, all compared. The picture that emerged was damning. The HOA's obsession with the lodge wasn't just about pride, it was about survival. If their authority could be challenged and defeated, then scrutiny of their practices would only grow, and scrutiny was the last thing they could withstand. Neighbors began to catch on. At community meetings, more residents voiced frustration, not just about the fight with the lodge, but about the neglect of their own properties. Potholes in the roads went unrepaired. Streetlights remained dark for months. The swimming pool sat closed due to budget constraints, even as legal fees mounted. The question was no longer whether the board could control the lodge. It was whether the board could justify its own existence. The president of the HOA, once so commanding, now looked strained and brittle. Her speeches carried less conviction, her tone more shrill. Where once she had spoken with absolute authority, now she sounded defensive, scrambling to hold on to power slipping through her fingers. And all the while, the sabotage escalated. One night, the lodge's power flickered and died. The outage was traced not to a storm or utility failure, but to deliberate tampering at the electrical box near the property line. Another time, the homeowner returned to find graffiti sprayed across the side of the lodge, crude slogans accusing them of being a freeloader and a parasite. Each act was reported, each added to the growing file of evidence. By now, even the governor's office was paying closer attention. What had begun as a property dispute had spiraled into something larger, a case study in the abuse of power and the dangers of unchecked authority. Officials monitored the situation carefully, knowing that another intervention might soon be necessary. But the most explosive revelation came not from officials, but from within the community itself. A former board treasurer, long since moved out of the neighborhood, reached out anonymously. They provided documents, emails, and records that painted a shocking picture. Funds had been misappropriated for years, siphoned off into personal accounts and shell companies. The fight against the lodge had been used as a smokescreen, a way to justify outrageous expenses and distract residents from asking too many questions. The lodge wasn't just an annoyance. It was a threat to the entire operation. The homeowner now held evidence not only of harassment, but of corruption. And with that evidence came power. The decision was made to bide time, to continue documenting, to continue letting the board reveal its desperation. Every act of sabotage, every baseless accusation, every misuse of funds only strengthened the case. The homeowner knew that when the time came, the board would not just be defeated over the lodge. They would be dismantled entirely. Yet the board sensed danger closing in. They didn't know the full extent of what had been uncovered, but they felt the shift in the air. Neighbors were no longer afraid. The homeowner was no longer isolated. And the governor's office was no longer watching quietly from a distance. Desperation breeds recklessness. And so, as summer deepened and the lake shimmered in the long evenings, the HOA prepared its most audacious move yet. They would not just harass. They would not just sabotage. They would attempt to seize control of the lodge outright through a maneuver so outrageous, so brazen, that it would shock even those who had seen their antics before. The stage was set for the next clash. The saboteurs had grown reckless, the secrets of corruption were unraveling, and the community was watching with widening eyes. The board was cornered, and cornered enemies are the most dangerous of all. The tension between the homeowner and the HOA had reached a boiling point. For months, the board had alternated between harassment and sabotage, trying everything in its power to force surrender. Yet nothing had worked. Every scheme had backfired. Every intimidation tactic had only hardened the homeowner's resolve. And worse for the board, the community had begun to see through their facade. The once commanding presence of the HOA president was now diminished, her speeches sounding less authoritative and more desperate. Residents who once followed her lead unquestioningly now whispered about financial mismanagement and missing funds. The board's credibility was slipping, its authority eroding. For the HOA, this was more than a feud. It was survival, and survival required drastic measures. It was at a closed-door meeting, held late one evening in the clubhouse, that the idea first surfaced. The lodge could not be claimed through the courts. The law had spoken too clearly, but perhaps, the board reasoned, the lodge could be claimed through possession. If the homeowner could be forced off the property, if the board could stage a takeover, perhaps they could argue the case differently. They could frame it as abandonment, as community reclamation, as whatever fictions suited their purposes. The plan was as brazen as it was reckless. They would storm the property. Not through legal channels, not through arbitration, but through sheer intimidation and presence. They would appear at the lodge en masse, declaring it under HOA jurisdiction, and attempt to force the homeowner out physically. In their minds, the optics of a large, coordinated presence might scare the homeowner into leaving voluntarily. Once gone, they could barricade themselves inside and spin the story to their advantage. What the board failed to consider was that such an act would not be seen as authority. It would be seen as trespassing, as invasion. The morning of the attempt was deceptively calm. The lake glistened under the sun, the water gently lapping against the repaired dock. Birds called from the trees, and a breeze carried the scent of pine and earth. It should have been a peaceful day, but in the distance, the sound of engines broke the calm. One by one, vehicles rolled down the road leading toward the lodge. SUVs, trucks, and sedans, many with HOA board members inside, others with their most loyal supporters. They came in a convoy, their presence impossible to ignore. At the head of the line was the HOA president, her jaw set, her eyes blazing with determination. Neighbors who saw the procession described it later as something out of a movie, a parade of cars heading toward confrontation, their drivers grim-faced and resolute. Some followed out of loyalty, others out of curiosity, but all knew something extraordinary was about to happen. When they arrived at the lodge, they didn't hesitate. The group spilled out of their vehicles and onto the gravel drive, a crowd of nearly 24, led by the president herself. They carried clipboards, files, and in some cases tools and chains. Their intent was clear. They had come not to talk, but to take. The homeowner, however, was ready. From the first sign of trouble weeks earlier, preparations had been made. Security cameras monitored every approach. Motion sensors tracked movement. And most importantly, the local authorities had been alerted to the possibility of escalation. It was not paranoia. It was foresight. As the crowd surged forward, declaring the property theirs, the cameras captured every angle. The boldness of their actions left no room for ambiguity. They were trespassing, plain and simple, their intentions unmistakable. And within minutes, as if on cue, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The sheriff's department had arrived. The officers pulled up swiftly, their presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. Lights flashed, commands rang out, and the crowd faltered. What had begun as a show of strength suddenly looked like a spectacle of lawlessness. Board members who had been so bold minutes earlier now shuffled nervously, realizing the gravity of what they had done. The president tried to hold firm, waving papers and shouting about community authority, but the officers were unmoved. The lodge was private property, its ownership clearly documented, and the board had no legal right to be there. Their actions weren't governance. They were trespass, harassment, and in some cases, attempted burglary. The officers dispersed the crowd, taking statements, collecting footage from the homeowners' cameras, and warning the board members of the consequences of their actions. Some residents quietly slipped away, embarrassed to have been part of the stunt. Others remained defiant, muttering about unfair laws and corrupt officials. But the damage was done. The attempted takeover had failed spectacularly. And worse, for the board, it had been witnessed by nearly the entire community. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who had once been sympathetic to the HOA now viewed them with suspicion and disgust. The image of the board storming private property was too much to excuse, too blatant to justify. Their credibility, already fragile, was shattered. But the fallout didn't stop there. The homeowner's careful documentation, combined with the footage of the attempted takeover, made its way to the governor's office once again. This time, the outrage was palpable. The board hadn't just overstepped, it had defied the very foundation of property rights. Officials who had been content to watch from a distance now considered direct intervention. At the same time, the evidence of financial misconduct began to surface publicly. Residents demanded answers about the HOA's spending. Questions that had been ignored for months now took center stage. Where had the money gone? Why were dues so high while amenities remained neglected? And why, above all, had so much been poured into a fruitless battle against a single homeowner? The board scrambled to respond, offering vague explanations and promises of audits. But the excuses rang hollow. Too much had been revealed, too much trust had been lost. The attempted takeover had not just failed, it had exposed the board's corruption to the light. Behind closed doors, the board fractured. Some members, fearing legal consequences, considered resigning. Others doubled down, urging resistance at any cost. The president, however, remained defiant. To her, the battle was not lost. She still clung to the belief that the lodge represented a threat to her authority, a symbol that had to be destroyed. But with every passing day, her position weakened. The law was no longer on her side, the community was no longer behind her, and the homeowner was no longer isolated. The stage was set for the inevitable conclusion. The board had pushed too far, exposed too much, and burned too many bridges. Their attempted takeover had turned the tide, uniting the community not against the homeowner, but against the HOA itself. Yet the board was not finished. Pride and desperation drove them onward. If they could not win by law, by sabotage, or by intimidation, then they would seek to delay the inevitable. They would cling to power until the very last moment, even as their empire crumbled around them. The homeowner, meanwhile, prepared for the final chapters of the battle. With evidence in hand, allies at their side, and the law firmly backing them, the end was near. But as any seasoned fighter knows, the most dangerous moment is not the first strike. It is the last gasp of a cornered opponent. The HOA was cornered, and it was about to lash out one final time. The attempted takeover of the Lakeside Lodge had been a turning point. What the HOA board had envisioned as a bold display of authority had instead revealed them as reckless trespassers. The sheriff's flashing lights, the cameras rolling, the stunned faces of residents. It was all too public to deny, too blatant to spin. Word spread not just through the community but across the county, and within days, the governor's office had received multiple complaints from residents demanding action. The HOA had always thrived in the shadows of authority. Their power came from intimidation, bureaucracy, and the assumption that neighbors would comply rather than fight. But now their actions had dragged them into the light, and in that light, their flaws were visible for all to see. The board president tried to recover, holding emergency meetings where she insisted the attempted takeover was a misunderstanding. She painted it as an effort to inspect community property, even as the video footage circulating among residents showed a mob with chains, tools, and defiant shouts. Her words carried little weight now. Once her voice had been commanding. Now it sounded defensive, brittle, and desperate, but the attempted takeover was only the surface of their undoing. Behind the scenes, the financial irregularities were beginning to unravel with alarming speed. Residents, emboldened by the lodge owner's resilience, demanded access to budgets and expense reports. And when those reports were finally pried from the board's hands, the numbers didn't add up. Tens of thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. Payments had been made to shell companies that no one could trace. Landscaping and maintenance contracts, supposedly worth thousands, had been awarded to businesses tied directly to board members' relatives. The facade of community stewardship crumbled. Anger spread like wildfire. At neighborhood gatherings, residents voiced outrage not just at the harassment of the lodge owner, but at the neglect of their own properties. Streetlights had gone unfixed for months. Potholes remained unfilled. The community pool, once a centerpiece of summer life, sat drained and shuttered. All the while, their money had been poured into frivolous lawsuits, harassment campaigns, and personal enrichment. The board's corruption was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus. The homeowner, who had quietly collected evidence for months, now began sharing what they had gathered. Records of inflated contracts, copies of budgets that shifted mysteriously year to year, testimony from a former treasurer who admitted funds had been siphoned away for personal use. Every piece fit into a puzzle that revealed the truth. The HOA's battle for the lodge had never been about rules or community standards. It had been about control, distraction, and greed. When the governor's office received this growing pile of evidence, their response was swift. A formal investigation was launched, and investigators began interviewing residents, combing through financial records and tracing payments. What they found shocked even those who had suspected wrongdoing. The HOA wasn't just overzealous, it was corrupt. Funds had been misused for years, and the obsession with the lodge had been a convenient excuse to mask it. The pressure on the board intensified. Some members, fearing criminal charges, quietly resigned. They issued vague statements about personal reasons and slipped away, hoping to escape the fallout. Others tried to distance themselves from the president, blaming her for the board's downfall. But the damage was too deep, the corruption too widespread. Every resignation, every deflection only confirmed the rot within. The president, however, refused to yield. Her pride, once her greatest strength, was now her undoing. She stood firm at meetings, insisting the lodge remained a violation of community standards, insisting the courts had erred, insisting the governor's investigators were biased. But each insistence only highlighted her detachment from reality. Neighbors who once supported her now shook their heads in disbelief, watching her unravel before their eyes. Meanwhile, the acts of sabotage continued, but now they were clumsy and obvious. Spray-painted insults on the lodge walls, nails scattered on the driveway, a window shattered in the dead of night. Each incident was immediately documented and handed to investigators, each one adding to the growing list of charges. It was clear the board's campaign had devolved from calculated harassment into petty vandalism, and the community was watching it all. The unraveling was not just political, it was personal. Residents who had trusted the board with their money and their neighborhood felt betrayed. Friendships were strained. Neighbors who had once stood together now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who had supported the harassment, who had looked the other way, who had benefited from the corruption. The HOA, once seen as a stabilizing force, was now a symbol of division and shame. The lodge, ironically, became the opposite. What had started as the board's target of hatred now became a symbol of resistance and resilience. Neighbors who had avoided the property before now stopped by to offer support. Some brought food, others offered tools or labor to repair the damage from vandalism. The homeowner, once isolated, was now surrounded by allies. The lodge stood not just as a home, but as a monument to standing firm against abuse of power, and the board's undoing reached its climax at a special meeting called to address the growing scandal. The clubhouse was packed that evening. Every chair filled, every wall lined with standing residents. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. On one side sat the board, visibly strained and diminished. On the other side, the residents, angry, frustrated, and demanding answers. The president attempted to speak, her voice rising over the murmurs, but the crowd was no longer listening. They had questions, and they wanted accountability. Where had the money gone? Why had dues been raised year after year while services declined? Why had their community been dragged through lawsuits, harassment, and public scandal over a property that was never under the board's control? The president's answers were weak, evasive, and unconvincing. She waved papers, blamed misunderstandings, and accused her critics of disloyalty. But every word she spoke only deepened the outrage. Residents shouted her down, demanding she resign, demanding new leadership, demanding justice. And then, at the height of the chaos, investigators entered the room. The silence was immediate and profound. The presence of state officials, flanked by law enforcement, made it clear that this was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. This was a matter of law. Documents were served, board members were questioned, and the president herself was warned of the charges she might soon face. The meeting ended not with resolutions, but with the undeniable reality that the HOA as it had existed was finished. The final unraveling had begun. In the days that followed, the board crumbled. More resignations came, each one a tacit admission of guilt. The president, stubborn to the end, refused to step down until she was forced out by legal mandate. Residents called for new elections, and for the first time in years, the HOA showed signs of becoming what it was meant to be, a body that served the community, not itself. For the homeowner, the ordeal had been long and grueling. The sabotage, the lawsuits, the takeover attempt, all of it had tested their resolve. But they had stood firm, and in doing so, they had exposed not just the abuse of their own property rights, but the corruption of an entire system. The lodge remained standing, stronger than ever, its walls scarred but unbroken. It had weathered the storm, and in the process, it had brought down the very institution that sought to destroy it. Yet as the dust settled, one truth became clear. The HOA's final defeat was not just about the lodge. It was about a community reclaiming its voice, about neighbors refusing to be silenced, and about the inevitable collapse of those who abuse power. The battle for the Lakeside Lodge was nearly over. But the consequences for those who had waged it were only beginning. The summer that had begun with hope and ended in chaos now gave way to a season of reckoning. The HOA's months-long campaign against the Lakeside Lodge, once a source of fear and frustration, had collapsed spectacularly. The attempted takeover, the harassment, the sabotage, all of it had failed. More importantly, it had exposed the corruption that had festered within the association for years. Now the final chapter of this long battle was underway, as law, community, and accountability converged to bring the story to its conclusion. Investigators from the governor's office, accompanied by local law enforcement and financial auditors, descended upon the HOA's headquarters. They pored over records, contracts, and bank statements, cross-referencing the board's claims with reality. What they discovered was damning. Tens of thousands of dollars in community funds had been misused. Payments had been funneled to shell companies linked to board members, and dozens of expenses had been falsified to conceal both personal enrichment and the obsessive campaign against the lodge. The homeowner, who had patiently documented every letter, visit, and act of sabotage, provided the investigators with the final pieces of the puzzle: security footage, photographs of vandalism, copies of official deeds, and correspondence from the governor's office all formed a detailed narrative of harassment and lawbreaking. The homeowner's careful record-keeping ensured that the investigators could trace each act back to the responsible parties, leaving no room for doubt or manipulation. Residents, once fearful of retaliation, now found their voices amplified by the mounting evidence. Community meetings, which had long been dominated by the board's heavy-handed authority, became forums for truth. Questions about missing funds, the failed amenities, and the constant harassment of the lodge were no longer brushed aside. Board members attempted to respond, but their words lacked credibility. The weight of the documentation, the support of law enforcement, and the scrutiny of the public left them exposed. The president of the HOA, once a figure of unchallenged power, faced the full brunt of accountability. Legal notices were served, demanding her resignation and outlining the potential criminal and civil consequences for her actions. Her attempts to defend herself fell flat against the overwhelming evidence of fraud, harassment, and mismanagement. Even loyal supporters began to withdraw, unwilling to be implicated in a collapsing organization. Meanwhile, the lodge, the focal point of this epic struggle, remained untouched. Its walls bore the faint scars of past sabotage, but its structure, its legal status, and its symbolic power were intact. The homeowner, who had endured months of intimidation, now walked freely across the property, confident in both the law and the community's support. The dock, repaired and reinforced, gleamed under the sunlight, a silent testament to resilience and persistence. The culmination of the investigation brought formal charges against several board members. Financial misappropriation, harassment, trespassing, and attempted property seizure were among the accusations. The legal system moved swiftly, and within weeks, hearings were scheduled to address the full scope of the board's misconduct. Public attention remained high, fueled by local media coverage and the testimony of residents who had long suffered under the board's authority. The courtroom, when it convened, was packed. Neighbors attended in record numbers, bearing witness to the proceedings and lending weight to the homeowner's account. Each piece of evidence was presented with clarity: invoices, bank records, photographs, and video footage of every harassment attempt. The board's defense was shaky at best, relying on technicalities and selective interpretations of bylaws that no longer held water under scrutiny. One by one, the charges were confirmed. Judges, after reviewing the extensive evidence, ruled decisively in favor of the homeowner and the affected residents. The HOA was ordered to repay misappropriated funds, reimburse legal expenses incurred by the homeowner, and formally dissolve the corrupt board. Restrictions were placed on the HOA's ability to engage in enforcement until new vetted leadership could be installed. It was a complete and public victory, both symbolic and practical. Residents who had once been silenced by fear now celebrated. Community meetings shifted from tense confrontations to constructive planning. Discussions focused on infrastructure improvements, neighborhood events, and fair management of resources. The oppressive atmosphere that had dominated for years began to lift, replaced by cautious optimism and a renewed sense of community. For the homeowner, the victory was deeply personal. Months of harassment, sleepless nights, and the constant stress of defending one's property had taken a toll, but the law had ultimately prevailed. The lodge, which had been targeted not just for its physical presence but for its independence, now stood as a symbol of legal protection and personal perseverance. The victory was a reminder that knowledge of one's rights, careful documentation, and steadfast resolve could overcome even the most determined attempts at intimidation. The HOA's fall also served as a cautionary tale. News coverage highlighted the dangers of unchecked authority, the consequences of mismanaged funds, and the ethical failings of those who misuse positions of power. Other communities took note, revisiting their own governance structures and enforcement practices. The story of the lodge became a case study in both resilience and accountability, a reminder that the law exists not just on paper, but as a tool to protect citizens from overreach. In the weeks following the legal resolution, the lodge itself became a place of quiet reflection. Repairs were completed, minor damages from previous sabotage were restored, and the property began to feel like a home once again. The dock, polished and reinforced, extended into the lake, inviting long walks and contemplative moments by the water. Nature, which had always offered solace, resumed its role as a comforting presence. Birds sang, the lake shimmered under sunlight, and the breeze carried the familiar scents of pine and earth. The homeowner took time to reconnect with neighbors, many of whom had become allies during the ordeal. These relationships, forged in the heat of conflict, provided a new sense of belonging and community. Together, they organized cleanups, minor repairs, and neighborhood events that strengthened bonds rather than sowed division. The HOA, now under strict oversight, began the slow process of rebuilding trust, but the shadow of past misconduct lingered. Residents remained vigilant, knowing that accountability must be maintained to prevent history from repeating itself. As autumn approached, the lodge settled into its role not just as a private retreat, but as a symbol of victory and resilience. The property's legal and physical integrity were intact, the harassment had ended, and the corrupt board had been removed from power. The saga that had begun with threats, letters, and intimidation had concluded with justice, transparency, and the reaffirmation of individual rights. The homeowner often reflected on the journey, recalling moments of fear, frustration, and uncertainty. Each challenge, the relentless letters, the late-night sabotage, the attempted takeover, and the public humiliation, had tested patience and resolve. Yet each obstacle had also strengthened determination, sharpened focus, and revealed the importance of community and legal recourse. In the end, the lodge stood not just as a building by the lake, but as a testament to endurance, legal protection, and the principle that no amount of intimidation or corruption can override truth. Residents, now empowered by the exposure of wrongdoing, took lessons from the saga to heart, ensuring that future boards would be held accountable, that rules would be applied fairly, and that freedom and property rights would not be taken for granted. And so, the Lakeside Lodge returned to the quiet peace it had promised from the beginning. The sunlight danced across the water, the trees whispered in the breeze, and the dock extended invitingly into the lake. Life returned to its natural rhythm, uninterrupted by letters, fines, or intimidation. The homeowner could finally walk freely, knowing the property was secure, the law on their side, and the community aware and vigilant. The HOA, stripped of power and facing legal consequences, became a cautionary tale, a story shared among neighboring communities, a viral example of the consequences of unchecked authority. And the lodge, once the target of harassment, now stood as a beacon of resilience, reminding everyone that patience, documentation, and the support of the law could overcome even the most determined attempts at abuse. Months later, as the leaves turned golden and the lake mirrored the autumn sky, the homeowner stood at the edge of the dock looking out over the water. The battles had been long, the stress immense, but the victory was complete. The lodge was theirs, legally, physically, and symbolically. The storm had passed, leaving behind, not destruction, but a stronger, wiser community, and a home that would remain safe and secure for years to come. Justice had prevailed. Resilience had triumphed, and the Lakeside Lodge, once threatened by overreach and corruption, now belonged fully and unquestionably to its rightful owner,